Okay, so now in this video I'm going to look at the legal situation and the moral and ethical situation about returning a sample from Mars to Earth. And often when people talk about sending, like for instance Mars 1 or whatever, the colonists talking about sending colonists to Mars or returning samples to Mars, it's both the same. I'm going to talk about both because I think it's worth going into both when you're talking about the legal situation. Then they often talk about it as being just a very easy thing to do, pass a few laws and then get into a spaceship and off you go, and you think like within a year or two you're just like almost like getting a driving license or something. But if you look into it, it is far, far more complicated. It is very extensive and difficult legal processes involved before we can even think about sending a colonist to Mars or returning a sample from Mars to Earth. And the only way that could be avoided is if you could prove conclusively that it's going to make absolutely no difference to Mars or to Earth to do that as far as transfer of life. And nobody, certainly Robert Zubin's arguments convince some, maybe, but it's certainly not conclusive, and we've seen that there's very strong evidence for suggesting that life on Mars is interestingly different and would be affected by Earth life, even if there is life on Mars at all. And also that life returned to Earth, there's plenty of reasons for thinking it could be hazardous. And probably with very low probability, but still a possibility. So now if we look at the legal situation, there are quite a few laws involved here. The most important one, first of all, is the Outer Space Treaty. And this is a treaty that almost everyone has agreed to, a few exceptions such as North Korea. But just about everyone has signed. All the responsible nations, as it were, have apologies if you're North Korean, but just about everyone on the Earth has signed this treaty. And it's got this provision about nations preventing harmful contamination of other places in the solar system or returning to Earth. Now there's a big, long legal debate about what is meant by harmful in that little clause. It's just one of these very short clauses that lawyers argue about for generations as to what it actually means. But the generally accepted consensus is that it means harmful to the scientific interests of other nations. So if you introduce life from Earth to Mars, for instance, Earth life, then this will be extremely complicating of our delicate scientific experiments on Mars. These are able to detect a single amino acid in a gram of soil. They'll be able to detect a single DNA molecule very easily once we get to the point of sending DNA sequences to Mars. So if there is no Earth life on Mars, then this would give conclusive, immediate evidence that there is Martian life that was evolved independently. If you contaminate Mars with Earth life, then that makes things far, far more difficult for these experimenters. It's no good just detecting an amino acid. Well, an amino acid could be evidence of meteorites, but no good just detecting DNA or clear biosignatures. You then have to try and find out whether it is a Mars-based biosignature or an Earth-based biosignature. So there's no doubt at all this is harmful to the scientific interests of other parties to the treaty. And it seems very hard to think of any way where you could colonize Mars without a very high risk of introducing Earth life to Mars. Because of the possibility of surface habitats on present-day Mars, the extreme durability of certain microorganisms in dormant form, and the shielding effect of the iron oxides in the dust and the dust storms, and the microorganisms could be spread almost anywhere on the planet. And so this then takes you to a legal situation where I just don't think it is within the remit of COSPAR. So COSPAR, they are the ones who interpret the Outer Space Treaty for for the scientific community generally. And it's a group of scientists from all over the world who meet together every 2 years and have a great long talk about all these issues to do with the regulations. And some of them are just one of the things they look at are the possibility of interplanetary contamination. So they can do that within the Outer Space Treaty so far, but I think once you get human beings going to Mars and landing on Mars and bringing microorganisms there, and you want to regulate whether that's possible or not, then that surely goes beyond the remit of the Outer Space Treaty. Now, I just want to say that what I'm talking about here is there's a very good paper that Margaret Race did. Margaret Race she's with the SETI Institute. She was originally with the Planetary Protection Office, so she's very knowledgeable about this whole area and has written many papers on related topics. She's one of the chief scientists for SETI, and so she has a paper on the legal situation. So I will put that as a link in the comments, so you can read this if you want to go into details of the legal situation. And if I've made any mistakes, hopefully they will be correct. You'll find the correction of them in that paper. So I'm just presenting a layman's view, and as best as I know it. And then you can follow it up further if you're intrigued by what I say. So that's first of all the Outer Space Treaty. But now, if we're talking about returning samples from Mars to Earth, there are many other very important regulations. So first of all, there's the let's suppose it's returned to by NASA to the United States. It might be different in other situations, but that's what she looks at in her paper. So let's look at that, and it'll give some idea of what it's like for other nations too. So first of all, the NASA quarantine rule, which was in place for Apollo, then this has been rescinded. So you can't just use that. It would also indeed also be totally inadequate by modern standards, but legally you can't, according to modern scientific knowledge, it wouldn't quarantine the samples adequately. But never mind that, as a law, it no longer exists, you can't use it. And you might think that surely it must be quite easy to bring this law into place, because with Apollo, just within a few years they were already bringing back samples from the moon, which at that time they thought could possibly have life in it. But the situation is very different today. We are much more aware of these things, there's much more public awareness, there's much more public accountability. Everything has to be done very openly. And in the case of Apollo, then the quarantine regulation was only published on the very day that Apollo 11 was launched to the moon. And there's supposed to be public discussion of it before it comes into place. But obviously, with it published on the day of the launch of the moon, there was no possibility for public discussion of it. They just published, said this is what we're going to do by way of quarantine, and then they brought the samples back and did whatever was in the documents. Now this would not be permitted today. You wouldn't be able to do that. Nobody could do that. And there are many difficulties involved in passing legislation about quarantine. And as well as all the issues having to look into these gene transfer agents, possibility of XNA, and all the things that these people have looked into for the Mars sample return, but there's also another aspect to it, is human rights. So if you have human beings working in this facility and they then get infected by the Martian life form, then they would have to be confined potentially to that facility for the rest of their life or until it's proved to be safe. And that is an issue with legal issue with human rights. Even if they volunteer to do that, can you do that when you haven't committed any crime? Can such a law be passed? So there are lots of difficulties, legal difficulties, that would probably run on for quite a long time, just in order to sort out the complexities of the quarantine, even once you know everything you want to do in the regulations. So then after that, there are many things that didn't exist in the time of Apollo. So you have the environmental regulations, and then it seems very likely that the I can't remember the name for it now, but there's a special thing that the president has to do, and there would be a special investigation of this whole thing. It would impact on environmental laws, and it would impact on, because of the possibility of infecting the sea, it impacts on laws to do with the sea, and because of the possibility of it impacting on infecting other nations, then you start getting international laws to do with health, and you also have domestic laws that is quite possible that nations in other nations, they could bring up their own domestic legislation in the United Nations and say that this thing that the United States planning to return the sample is impacting on our own domestic health laws, and so we can object under our own domestic laws, not even under international laws. And so, as you can see, and then also, of course, just as with the contamination of Mars, then the Outer Space Treaty, if you decide that Earth is going to be contaminated, there's nothing you can do about it. But generally, with the back contamination, they're thinking in terms of containment of it and making sure that it can't contaminate Earth. So I'm not saying that it can't be done. And if you could prove that it can be done safely, returned to Earth without any chance at all of contamination, but you still have to go through a long legislative minefield. It would take at least a decade, probably decades, to go through all the procedures. And so then there's an ethical dimension to this as well. So, and I think this also applies both ways, both for human beings colonizing Mars and from Mars back to Earth. But the main study I know is by a theologian, a US theologian, and he looked at the ethical dimension for the return to Earth. In the thing I'm remembering just now anyway. I don't know if he did anything on forward contamination. But so then the ethical dimension is that it's no longer a scientific question. So if you look at the European Space Foundation, for instance, when they looked into the sample return from Mars to Earth, then they applied rules such as that you should make the probability of an escape less than 1 in a million. And then they looked at how scientifically you can make that happen. However, that is a rule that has been brought in for a very different situation, biohazard facilities, where you know exactly what it is that you are containing. But here we're talking about an unknown hazard from Mars. And just like with the study of XNA in laboratories, then people have argued you should have much higher or much lower probabilities, or much lower possibility of escape, like 1 in 10 to the 20. So that's 1 in, I don't know, million, it's 1 in 100 million. Very different from the chance of 1 in a million. So the thing is that scientists can't make these decisions. It's not a scientific decision to decide what the probability should be, whether it should be 1 in a million. So for instance, with biohazard facilities, this is a matter of legislation and public discussion. And so it's exactly the same, I think, with Mars sample return. This is the ethical side of it, that whatever it says in the law, that human beings should be in, that not just scientists, it impacts on everyone. If it is a risk and it escapes, and it leads to pandemics or mass extinctions or worse, then that is something that will impact on everyone in the world. So we are all involved in the decision, and we can't just leave this sort of decision can't be left to scientists. The scientists can give us all the information that we need to make the decision, and scientists of course will be involved in making the decision along with everyone else. But they are not the people who can make the decision. They can only work out how to do the science to make sure that whatever decision is made is held to. For instance, if you say probability is 1 in a million, or probability has to be 1 in 10 to the 20, they then start working on the science for that. And so, anyway, this theologian, he argued very strongly that it has this ethical dimension, and that you should have people from all different cultures and countries and ethical points of views, including religious people and non-religious people, philosophers, people from different ethical points of view. And he also said that because there's so much unknown, it's so little known what might be on Mars, then we need to pay attention. It needs to be very open, so that everybody knows or anything that's submitted, everybody knows about it. If someone submits an objection, a white paper, or maybe a video, or whatever it is they do, then everybody has to see that, not just some small select committee that looks at it. And it has to be examined by some large committee of lots of people from many different backgrounds looking at this, not just a small group from one country. A very open process, and he said that even if that a minority view submissions need to be looked at seriously. And you don't just dismiss them and say it's only Joe Bloggs from Uruguay who said this. You have to look very carefully and see, is this a serious risk? And everybody involved has to discuss this. So that's the ethical and moral side of it. And I think many people would agree with him on this. And so now I'm going on to the next thing, which is about sample containment. So that's when we start talking about the next thing, whether we can safely return a sample from Mars to Earth. Now, another thing that Margaret Race, she strongly recommended in her paper, is that we should sort this out. So you go to the public, but it's much better if as scientists you can work everything else out first. I can't remember what she said exactly in her paper, but she was saying that we should think about this and not just blindly go ahead and hope the legislation will work itself out. And so, sort of interpreting that myself, I think that we should, as scientists should look very closely at the scientists. And the more we understand the science of Mars, the more we understand what is going on, and present this as a very clear picture to the public, the better chance of coming to a good decision. Which might be return the sample, but at that stage you know it's going to be safe. Or it might be, because you've discovered XNA on Mars, that you decide not to return it. And at that point, everyone, the scientists and the public, would probably agree that extreme caution is needed. So my own point of view is I think that it is too soon to return a sample from Mars. If we try and do one just now, then it will be almost impossible to convince everyone, and I'm unlikely to convince myself that it is safe to do it. And we definitely need to find out an awful lot more about Mars and whether there is life on that, and know a lot more about the planet before there's even a chance of having convincing arguments that everyone will accept to say that it is safe to return a sample from Mars to Earth. I think it probably will happen eventually, unless it turns out that Martian XNA is amazingly different and interesting from Earth, in which case it's even possible that we might decide never to do it. So I don't rule that out as a possibility, just depending on what Martian life is like. And so anyway, I'm putting my own point of view, but you think about it for yourself. Everybody needs to think about this independently, and the more people who have thinking about it independently, different people, their different points of view, the better the chance that we as humanity will make good decisions on this matter. And so now, so now I'm going to talk about the actual, I talk about legal situation, that's right, this was about legal situation,